For years, the world only heard whispers, rumors of people who never came back, trains departing before dawn, names murmured in secret, streets suddenly emptied without explanation. Yet nothing was fully understood until, one day, the doors were opened. What the first witnesses found was not merely devastation, but something beyond description. Freight cars overflowing with bodies, rooms where breathing was nearly impossible, people sitting motionless on the ground, uncertain if they could even move. It wasn't a rescue, it was a revelation. The soldiers didn't just liberate. They searched, recorded, and stood stunned as survivors barely lifted their eyes. Then came the cameras, the written reports, the piles of documents, testimonies from those who saw everything and were never the same again. Soon after began another process: recounting, judging, archiving. From a train halted at Dachau to the gallows at Nuremberg, the sequence of events unfolded relentlessly. What remained offered neither solace nor full justice, only undeniable evidence of all that occurred while the world chose to look away. Deportation, terror, and separation. Silence itself became a sign of danger. Each time the loudspeakers stopped announcing orders or the patrols missed their usual rounds, a different kind of dread swept through the ghetto. It wasn't relief, it was muted fear. More than once, that stillness was the prelude to another raid. And when the soldiers arrived, they did so with chilling precision, without needing to shout or rush. They entered homes as though they already knew who to find. People were dragged out or lured away by force. It didn't matter if they were old or young, ill or pleading that they were essential to their work. Once a name appeared on the list, their fate was sealed. In the beginning, few truly understood where the missing were being taken. Rumors spread about labor camps, new settlements, places with food and shelter. Some even volunteered, hoping it might keep their families together. But reality soon crept in. Those who left sent no letters, left no trace, never returned. Whispers began about trains that never came back, about stations where crowds were herded aboard under the watch of armed guards. The railway platforms became scenes of terror. There were no clear instructions, only chaos, shouting, pushing, separation. People were lined up, judged in seconds, divided by age, gender, or health. Mothers begged to stay with their children. Some tried to conceal them in bundles or blankets. But the guards did not waver. A single gesture, a nod to the left, could mean death. A nod to the right, temporary survival. Inside the ghetto, news of each new deportation sparked waves of panic. Families hid their most vulnerable members. Secret chambers were dug beneath floors. False walls were built. Children dressed in adult clothes. Some forged papers or bribed officials in charge of the lists, but safety was never guaranteed. Raids came without warning, by night or in broad daylight, often armed with names no one expected to see. Betrayal grew common. In fear and desperation, some informed on others. Even a rumor that someone was hiding a fugitive could condemn an entire family. Informers believed they were buying a few more days of life. Escape became a desperate gamble. A few slipped through tunnels or hidden routes, but danger followed them outside the walls. They had to disguise themselves, adopt false identities, pretend not to be who they truly were. Many villagers refused to get involved. Some helped in secret, but many betrayed the fugitives out of fear or greed. Others chose not to flee, but to hide. Families confined themselves for weeks or months in dark, airless rooms, surviving on scraps smuggled to them by brave neighbors. Sometimes this silence saved lives. Other times, a single misplaced sound led to catastrophe. Inside the ghetto, the effects were stark. Streets emptied after every raid. Workshops fell silent. Schools shut down. Beds remained unmade. Houses that once held 6 or 7 people now had only 2 or 3, avoiding each other's eyes to forget who was gone. Fear no longer meant only death. it meant isolation. Information became a fragile weapon. Those who learned the lists in advance faced impossible choices: flee, hide, separate from loved ones. Yet, that knowledge could deceive as easily as it could protect, often used to extort, manipulate, or sow confusion. No one knew whom to trust. Each decision, to stay home or go to work, to hide a relative or seek new papers, carried irreversible risk. And still, life continued in hesitation. Every morning was a question of survival. Many realized the deepest pain wasn't only death itself, but the slow, unending process of separation. There were no farewells, no graves, only disappearances. People vanished amid shouts and train whistles, leaving the ghetto emptier, quieter, more suffocating each day. Every sunrise carried the same uncertainty. Would anyone return that night? Existence became a test of endurance. No assurances, no future in sight. Children learned silence. Mothers lost the words to comfort them. The crying that filled the air wasn't just fear. It was absence. The empty place of a sibling, a grandparent, a friend. It lingered like a shadow. When the distant sound of trains echoed, every heart froze. It was no longer just a sound. It was a warning. They knew its meaning. Hundreds packed into cars, unaware of where they were going. Those left behind struggled between guilt and relief. Guilty for living, relieved not to have been chosen. Hope intertwined with dread, and each day felt less like life and more like endurance. Rumors of the destinations spread. Talk of factories, labor camps, places of work and production. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that it was something far darker. Those who left didn't return. And when letters did arrive, they were brief, emotionless, written under watchful eyes. Some tried to organize, to share information, protect one another, rotate children between homes for safety. Families shared bread, clothes, and shelter. Yet fear slowly destroyed even those fragile bonds. The greater the oppression, the weaker the unity, not for lack of love, but from the desperate instinct to survive. Many parents entrusted their children to strangers, praying they might live. It wasn't abandonment. It was love in its most desperate form. Mothers clung to their children one last time, knowing it could be forever. And too often it was. Some managed to survive hidden under other identities in distant villages or in the homes of peasants who risked everything to hide them. Others weren't so lucky. The simple act of crying or saying their real name could seal their fate. Those left behind learned to live with the absence. Some kept the personal belongings of those who had left as if it would hold them close. A scarf, a cup, a pair of shoes. They were carefully placed in a corner as if at any moment someone might return and need them. But over time, those objects too became covered in dust and forgotten. The only thing that didn't disappear was memory, although even that was starting to hurt. The nights were especially difficult. The silence deepened. The walls seemed thinner, and dreams instead of rest brought confusing images of goodbyes, chases, and unfinished farewells. In many cases, they woke up with their bodies trembling and their hearts racing. They didn't know if it was from the cold or the nightmare, and sometimes it was both. In certain sectors of the ghetto, talk began of hiding in groups during the selections. Some prepared communal hiding places, attics, basement, trapdoors. Stories were told of those who had survived entire days without moving, barely breathing, while boots scoured the streets, looking for the next to be taken. But not everyone managed to go unnoticed. Sometimes a sneeze, a cry, or a simple crunch underfoot was enough to ruin everything. When that happened, the punishments fell not only on those in hiding, but also on those who had protected them. Still, many kept trying. The alternative was to give up without a fight. Every day of life was a small victory, even if it was filled with fear. In that context, even the smallest things took on new value. Sharing a piece of bread, exchanging information about an upcoming raid, offering a corner where someone could hide for the night. Every gesture was an act of resistance, even if it wasn't recognized as such. The system was designed to break people, not just in body, but also in spirit. The isolation, the separation, the terror, everything was calculated to destroy any form of organization or solidarity. But even in that hostile environment, moments of mutual support continued to emerge. They weren't frequent or easy, but they existed. And for many, they were the only thing that sustained the will to carry on. As the deportations intensified, so did the idea of home. Houses were no longer refugees. Neighbors were no longer reliable allies. Routines no longer offered solace. Everything came down to surviving another day. Some managed to do so for weeks, others for months. But in all cases, the experience left an indelible mark. The feeling that at any moment everything could disappear, even oneself. Goodbyes were swift when they existed. Goodbyes were swift when they existed. A hug, a glance, a whispered word. There was no time for more. And although some tried to remain steadfast, it was difficult to contain the trembling hands or the lump in their throats. Tears fell silently without fuss, as if even that could attract the wrong kind of attention. In that world, even pain had to be hidden. So it was that little by little separation ceased to be an exception and became everyday occurrence. Living with the constant fear of losing everything was the new norm. And although many adapted on the outside, on the inside they were shattering. Some showed it with their eyes, others with silence, and still others with that rigidity the body assumes when there is nothing left to do in the face of approaching destiny. Arrival at the concentration camp, there was no privacy or comfort in the camp. Everything was designed to break the body and then the mind. From the moment a person entered, the first thing they encountered wasn't a cell, nor a dormitory, but a line. One line for registration, another for clothing, another for hygiene, another for the endless wait. Time lost meaning, and the cold present from the first hours seemed endless. The body would begin to shiver without permission, and it wouldn't stop. The clothes issued didn't fit, nor did they provide warmth. They were a thin set, worn by others before, stained, marked, and without buttons. There was no choice. Striped shirts, baggy pants, loose caps, sometimes just one garment for the entire winter, and for the feet, torn or laceless shoes made of hardwood or torn cloth. Many received nothing, and the little that was obtained had to be exchanged quickly, because in the camp, an extra garment could be the difference between life and illness. No one asked whether a garment was for a woman or a man, whether it fit properly or not. The only thing that mattered was covering the skin. The latrines were far from where people slept. They were rows of hollows in cement or wooden benches with no dividers, no water, no doors, and no cleaning. They had to be used in full view of others. The stench was unbearable. Sometimes prisoners were beaten for taking too long, for going at the wrong time, for not being able to endure the diarrhea that so many suffered. In winter, going to the bathroom meant risking freezing to death, but staying put also meant getting sick. There was no rest. Some tried to use buckets, rags, or hidden corners, but everything was punished. Any deviation from the norm was considered insubordination, and punishments were not discussed. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. People received 1 bar of soap for weeks, sometimes for several inmates. There were no frequent showers. Water was scarce or frozen. Hair was not washed, nor were hands. Their bodies were covered in sores, rashes, and bites. Their nails grew black. Many lost their hair due to infections or the cold. Lice circulated among everyone. The women tried to cover their hair with whatever was at hand. Sometimes a piece of cloth served as a handkerchief. Other times, they just lowered their heads. No one smelled good. No one complained because complaining was a dangerous luxury. Sleeping was not a restorative activity either. It was done in hard wooden bunks, 3 or 4 levels without mattresses, sometimes only damp planks. Each inmate was allotted a tiny space shared with others. Bodies were piled up. One's feet were close to another's face. Those with a fever shivered next to those who could still stand upright. There were no sheets. Blankets were scarce and shared. In winter, one's breath froze as it left the mouth. One inhaled the vapor of one's companion. Some died in their sleep. Others pretended to sleep to avoid an order or a beating. The cold became a constant threat, not only because of the temperatures, but because of the lack of clothing, food, and movement. Sometimes the inmates were forced to remain outdoors for hours in the snow or rain in formations where no one could move. If someone fell, they couldn't get up without permission. If they shivered too much, they received a blow. If they spoke, they were punished. The body slowly lost its ability to generate heat. Some tried to shelter themselves with paper, rags, whatever they could find. But the security guards prevented it. Physical labor was mandatory, even for those unable to stand. Everyone was expected to perform from the first day. The sick too, the elderly too. If someone collapsed, they were dragged away. If they complained, they were beaten. If they resisted, they were eliminated. No one knew for sure what the punishment was for not following an order, but everyone knew better than to find out. Obedience did not guarantee life, but doubt did guarantee pain. Food was scarce, but not accidentally. Malnutrition was planned. Every day, people received a piece of bread, a soup of water with husks, a dark liquid called coffee. The food arrived in buckets, ladled out, unchecked. Some days there wasn't enough. Others there was. But the quality was so low that many vomited after eating. The feeling of hunger never went away. People talked about food all the time. They dreamed about food. Imaginary recipes were shared. Some kept crumbs in their pockets. Others bartered pieces of bread for a button, a string, a small blade. Their bodies, subjected to the cold, poor nutrition, and constant physical exertion, began to sag. Bones bulged out. Skin stuck to their faces. Eyes sank. Women no longer menstruated. Men lost strength. No one maintained their size, their voice, their shape. In a short time, everyone became shadows of their former selves. And by seeing each other, they saw themselves in the future. No one needed a mirror to know this. The body spoke for itself. In that place, the word health lost all meaning. Diseases ran rampant among the barracks, multiplying without contact. The cold, the lack of shelter, and the wet rags accelerated colds, fevers, and bodily weakness. No one spoke of the flu or bronchitis, because what began with a chill almost always ended with a sheet over one's face. No one asked for help. No one offered it. Silence in the face of illness was also a way of trying to survive another day. Water was present, but it wasn't drinkable. Sometimes it smelled of rust. Other times it came out cloudy. Other times it didn't come out at all. People drank from communal buckets filled with dirt, grease, even blood. Intestinal infections were inevitable. Many spent their days doubled over in pain, their bellies swollen, dragging themselves to the latrines. Vomiting, diarrhea, and hunger mingled into a single unending malaise. Some collapsed as they walked. Others sat against the walls, unable to get up, their eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Lice were a constant presence. They bit relentlessly, hiding in the seams of clothing, in mattresses, in the creases of the neck. Scratching was almost a reflex. Some tore at their own skin. Typhus spread by these parasites was another daily threat. When a barrack was declared infected, no one dared enter. The stench was unmistakable. No doctors were needed to know that if one contracted fever and skin blemishes, the end would soon follow. In those cases, the sick were taken to another section far away to die alone, their bodies serving as no excuse for further epidemics. Food no longer nourished. It was more symbolic than real, a lukewarm liquid in the morning, which some called soup, even though it didn't contain a single solid piece. At noon, a piece of black bread, damp, moldy. At night, another cup of hot water with floating residue. Sometimes, with luck, a bit of potato peel. But more often than not, the stomach rumbled, the head achy with emptiness, and weakness became the norm. Bones began to poke through the skin. The face sank. The body no longer recognized hunger as a sensation. It was something else deeper, as if the body were beginning to shut down from within. Some tried to make the most of what little they received. They cut the bread into tiny pieces, counted them, and distributed them throughout the day. Others hid it under the mattress, trading it for cigarettes or scraps of cloth. There was also theft. A moment of carelessness while sleeping could mean losing the only thing left to sustain life. At times the hunger was so unbearable that some ate food from freshly fallen corpses. This no longer shocked anyone. The horror had crossed that threshold long ago. Within the barracks, unwritten hierarchies were established. Some managed to stay near the stove if there was one. The strongest imposed their place. Some were foremen appointed by the guards. Others were simply more feared. Young women were often placed in central areas. The older ones near the door where the cold entered, without asking permission. The rules were dictated by necessity. It wasn't fair, nor was what happened outside fair. It was just that. Violence also existed among the prisoners themselves. Furrah nerves, constant pressure, and daily fear caused many to explode over the smallest things. A misunderstood glance, a disputed space in line, a loud word. Arguments were resolved with shivvies, insults, and blows. No one intervened. Everyone had their own internal battle. Solidarity, although it existed, was rare. There were those who shared a rag, a spoon, or a piece of advice to calm a fever, but that wasn't common. In the latrines, the humiliation was absolute. There were holes in the ground covered by rotten wood with no walls, no curtains, no privacy. The lines were long, especially in the early morning when stomachs were rumbling from chronic diarrhea. The smell permeated everything, even clothing. The smell permeated everything, even clothing. Those who didn't arrive on time did so in the barracks, not for lack of will, but because they couldn't stand. Some became ill just from exposure, from having to sit in the icy mud while their bodies trembled. No one judged. Everyone knew they could be the same tomorrow. There were prisoners who no longer spoke. They just stared as if they'd decided that keeping quiet was better than wasting energy. Others were delirious. They named names, spoke to the dead, and quietly begged for forgiveness. Some walked in circles. One even repeated the same phrase for hours. The mental damage was as evident as the physical. The youngest aged in weeks. The oldest faded away without anyone noticing. There were also the punishments. If someone was caught stealing bread, they were made to line up for hours in the sun or snow. If someone fell asleep on the job, they were beaten or sent to harsher areas. Sometimes the whole group suffered as a result. One mistake, and everyone would go without food. One out-of-place word, and the whole barracks would be punished. This sowed fear and mistrust. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to be responsible. The nights were worse. The cold came in through the cracks. The blankets were few, shared by 3 or 4 bodies. Some cried silently. Others prayed. Sometimes a voice sang something softly. Not out of joy, but out of habit. As if the songs helped remind them that at one time there had been a different life. With clean beds, hot food, and hugs. That memory was the only thing they couldn't take away from them, resisting without weapons the body and the mind. In an environment where the will was constantly broken by cold, hunger, and fear, bodies began to wither before the soul. But resisting didn't always mean raising a flag or escaping. Often, the true battle was fought from within, in silence, in thoughts that noon could steal, in simple gestures that preserved a bit of humanity. The days were all similar, row upon row, staring at the ground, hunched backs, bones sticking out from beneath a dirty, shapeless cloth, the ground muddy or frozen depending on the season, and the constant sound of forced footsteps and orders that brooked no reply. But amidst this repetitive and degrading cycle, some retained a part of themselves intact. There were those who murmured songs from their childhood while they worked. They didn't do it out loud or to others. It was a kind of barely perceptible whisper, a melody that helped set the rhythm, as if an inner beat could oppose the one dictated by screams or blows. Although their lips barely moved, That silent melody offered an anchor to something that once existed, a previous life where one could sing without punishment. Not everyone knew how to sing, but the memory of a song could be stronger than hunger. Prayers also remained alive, albeit in low voices with eyes open without visible signs, because any hint of devotion was seen as a challenge. Many didn't pray expecting an answer, but because it was the only habit that reminded them they were still people. They weren't long or elaborate prayers, just short phrases repeated over and over, like a formula learned as children that continued to make sense even when everything else had been lost. Thought was perhaps the last refuge. As their bodies dragged themselves among bricks, stones, tools, or corpses, many escaped with images of the past. They weren't always happy memories. Sometimes they were just details. The smell of warm bread, a mother's voice, the touch of clean fabric. Others tried to imagine impossible scenarios, like a set table or a room filled with light and warmth. It was in this capacity for imagination that some found a way to endure. Despite the divisions, the imposed hierarchies, and the constant fear, the gestures of humanity didn't completely disappear. Some shared a piece of stolen bread or pretended to be stronger to protect someone weaker during an inspection. Others whispered words of encouragement when no one else was listening, and there were those who simply sat next to another to keep them company in silence. A borrowed coat improperly fitted for a few minutes, a hand that helped someone get up after a fall, a steady, non-judgmental gaze. All of this had the value of rebellion. The cold which had pierced the bones since dawn couldn't completely extinguish those small flames. Even in the latrines, where the stench was unbearable, sometimes a prisoner would help another clean herself or hold a sick companion so she wouldn't collapse. In the barracks, when no one had the strength to speak anymore, shared breaths formed a kind of passive resistance. A torn blanket served too. A wet rag passed from one to another to cool the forehead. No one had anything, but some still shared what little remained. Despair appeared like a constant shadow. Many stopped speaking, moving, thinking. They walked as if they were already dead. Apathy was a form of defense, a response to the excess of horror. Others, however, were filled with a silent rage they couldn't channel. That fury didn't explode, but it accumulated in their muscles, in their clenched jaws, in their eyes that no longer shed tears. They resisted, not only with kindness but also with contained resentment. Hope, though fragile, also existed. Sometimes it came from a rumor that the Russians were near, that the Nazis were about to fall, that a transport had been lost. Other times hope had no basis, but it served its purpose just the same. Believing that someone outside remembered them, that the war was going to end, that perhaps they would survive to tell the tale. That idea, however remote or absurd, allowed some to get up the next day. In the hardest moments, even when their bodies refused to continue, there were those who forced themselves to maintain the routine, counting steps, mentally repeating a story, making a specific gesture every night before sleeping. Even if no one else saw it, this repeated act had enormous power. It reaffirmed that they were still there, not as shadows, but as people who, despite everything, had not been completely defeated. The nights were especially long. The cold pierced the wooden walls and the blankets were insufficient. Some hugged each other wordlessly simply to avoid freezing. It didn't matter whether they knew each other or not. Contact was a form of comfort that required no explanation. Sometimes someone would murmur a story, real or invented, to keep the minds that still resisted awake. The words didn't need to be coherent. It was enough to ward off the image of death for a few minutes. Some wrote sentences with a piece of charcoal hidden in walls or on old papers. Others traced symbols on the ground with their fingers. And some tried to draw in their minds the streets of their neighborhoods, the faces of their parents, the furniture in their homes. Although all of this seemed useless, it served to keep them whole. Memory was a weapon, even if no one saw it. Not everyone survived. Many fell from exhaustion, from illness, from sadness, but even among those who knew the end was approaching, some continued to sing inside, praying quietly, dreaming in silence. It was a way of not giving up completely, of preserving a spark that neither hunger nor terror could extinguish. Not everyone succeeded, but some did. And that was enough for the rest to try to continue. The bodies that had once run, laughed, danced, or written letters now only dragged themselves with difficulty on the frozen earth or the mud. But even those bodies stricken by hunger still hid something intact, an inner part that would not surrender. It was the will to exist, not as an open protest, but as a silent affirmation, breathing, staying upright. Looking ahead without fainting, all of this was an act of resistance. And although no one celebrated it or recorded it, these small acts were repeated every day in the darkest places. In moments of rest, if they could even be called that, some would find a corner and sit on their own 2 feet to keep warm. There, while the body trembled, the mind sought escape. Imagination was a secret passage, visualizing a hot meal, a conversation with a brother, or an ordinary afternoon in the sun. It didn't matter if the memory was real or invented. It served the same purpose. Because reality was too harsh to inhabit all the time, you had to step outside of it, even if only with your eyes closed. Sometimes a voice would appear, speaking softly, describing what their city, their house, their school, their street were like. It didn't do this to teach anything. It only spoke to hear its own voice say things it still remembered, as if naming them made them real for a moment. Others listened in silence. No one interrupted because, amidst the filth, the pain, and the brutality, that voice was a thread of the world they had lost. Listening to it was like touching something that hadn't yet been destroyed. There were those who maintained almost absurd routines. They combed their hair with their fingers, adjusted their torn clothes as if they still cared how they looked, washed their faces with a damp rag whenever they found water. They didn't do it for hygiene or pride. It was a way of saying, I'm still here. I'm still someone. I haven't been erased yet. The smallest gesture could carry the value of a declaration of existence. Even the most insignificant objects acquired significance. A button found in the ground, a thread that could be used to mend a shoe, a piece of paper that could be used to write a word. Some hid these objects as if they were treasures, because in a world where everything was controlled, to have something of one's own, no matter how small, was to have a slice of freedom. Sometimes someone would teach another person how to write their name or how to count in another language. It wasn't a formal class, just a brief exchange during a break. But learning something new, no matter how pointless it seemed, was a way of life of continuing to grow inside while everything else was wasting away outside. Learning wasn't a goal. It was a means to remind oneself that one's soul hadn't yet fallen asleep. There were also moments of humor, very brief, almost imperceptible. A sarcastic comment about a guard, an absurd phrase, a stifled laugh. No one laughed out loud, but a grimace could be enough. Humor wasn't mockery, it was defense, not against punishment, but against despair. Laughter, even if only internally, was a way of not giving up. Camaraderie wasn't always explicit. Sometimes it manifested itself in shared silence, in not ratting out others, in not pushing someone who had fallen, in not stealing a piece of bread. These omissions were forms of respect. In a place where betrayal could be rewarded, and informing saved lives, choosing not to do harm was already a form of courage. In some corners, on the walls or on the wooden planks, marks appeared. Counted lines, symbols, words written in charcoal or with nails. They were signs. Sometimes they were names, other times dates or short phrases. Nuna knew who had written them, but everyone knew they meant something. They were footprints, not to be read, but so that someone at some point would know that someone had been there who wanted to leave a record of their passage. Sleep was a battlefield. Sleep meant risking not waking up. But it was also a truce. Many dreamed of simple things, a full meal, a clean bed, a father's voice. But others had nightmares. The horror didn't disappear with their eyes closed. Still, there were those who preferred to sleep because, for a few hours, they could live in another world. Illness was a constant threat, but even in the face of it, there were acts of resistance. Sharing a blanket with a sick companion, giving up the last drink of water, staying by the side of someone who couldn't get up. No one forced them to do it. These were decisions born from the invisible bond that suffering could create. In these gestures, humanity survived the inhuman. When one of them died, there wasn't always crying. Sometimes they simply covered their face with a cloth or arranged their body so it wouldn't twist. It was a small act, wordless, but deeply meaningful. It meant that this person, although lost, hadn't been reduced to a number. They were still recognized as someone. There were those who knew they wouldn't make it out alive, yet they still acted as if the end was still far off. They walked upright, responded firmly, and avoided pleading. It wasn't pride. It was dignity, a way of saying that even though everything around them had fallen apart, they still chose how to take their final steps. Some had written fragments on hidden sheets of paper, on napkins, on scraps of cloth. They weren't letters. They were fragments of memory, short stories, lists of names, descriptions of what they saw. Writing was dangerous, but it also meant leaving proof that not everything had been erased. These writings weren't meant to be read at that moment. They were messages for an uncertain future. Hunger was perhaps the most persistent enemy. But even in the face of it, she resisted, eating more slowly, saving a crumb, exchanging one piece for another. There were strategies, calculations, decisions. It wasn't just about feeding themselves, but about prolonging their existence a little longer, about avoiding collapse. Even for a few hours, their gaze was also a form of resistance, looking straight ahead when everything indicated they had to bow their heads. Looking at each other without fear, without judgment, sharing an expression, a gesture, a sign. There was a silent communication that united them beyond words. That invisible network sustained many when they had no more strength. And when someone managed to escape, when they crossed a door, a gate, a border, they carried with them not only their own story, but that of all the others. Because resisting without weapons wasn't an individual act. It was a chain of silent gestures, secret thoughts, small actions. It was a way of staying alive without making a sound, without drawing attention, without allowing themselves to be completely destroyed. When the American troops arrived at the outskirts of the Dachau camp, the first thing they found was a stationary train made up of approximately 50 freight cars. Inside were rotting corpses. It was the sight they encountered before even opening a door. Some bodies were stacked to the ceiling. The train doors opened with difficulty, and inside there was no room for anything but death. Some soldiers couldn't look for long, others couldn't tear their eyes away. It was the first direct contact many of them had with something that until that moment they had only heard mentioned in fragmentary reports or comments between high-ranking officers. What they witnessed that day was not part of a military operation or traditional combat, but rather silent, tangible evidence of what had happened there before their arrival. Among the witnesses was a young military doctor named Harold Porter. As part of the team that entered with the first units, he wrote a letter describing what he saw. He spoke of bodies lying on the ground, of people barely breathing, of others lying motionless on the floor. Had described a room where bodies were piled up in a haphazard fashion, some naked, others dressed in rags. He said there were people so thin that every bone in them stood out, and that the smell in the air was so strong that many couldn't stand to remain there for more than a few minutes. He also mentioned the crematoriums, the shower rooms, and the feeling of standing in a place where the very idea of humanity had been extinguished. His words contained no judgment or drama. They simply recounted what was before their eyes as if trying to understand it weren't possible, only recording it. The reactions among the soldiers varied, But they all agreed on one thing: shock. Some were incredulous, others burst into tears. Some remained in absolute silence for hours, without saying a word, without moving beyond what was strictly necessary. Several vomited, others were unable to eat again for days. The army was prepared for battles, for gunfire, for explosions, but not for facing what appeared to be the result of meticulous extermination. Discipline was partially maintained. Some orders were given, others were ignored. In some cases, what was unleashed was not an operation, but a reaction. Among the commanding officers was Lieutenant William Walsh. Upon entering the camp and witnessing the condition of the prisoners, as well as the magnitude of what had happened there, he made decisions on his own. He ordered the immediate execution of German prisoners connected with the camp administration. Some were lined up along a wall, others inside a wagon. Several died that same day. Other prisoners of the camp, released just minutes before, were given weapons so they could act themselves. This wasn't a formal order, but a direct reaction based on what he had seen and what the prisoners told him. Some U.S. Army soldiers, including medics, refused to treat the German wounded. They justified themselves by saying they couldn't treat people who had participated in what had happened there. Days later, rumors surfaced that extrajudicial executions had taken place. Some military photographers took pictures. Testimonies were recorded. There were internal reports, but General George Patton, who had been appointed military governor of Bavaria, decided not to move forward with formal investigations. He halted the inquiries and didn't authorize further proceedings. According to the records, he preferred that the events not be officially reported, not out of ignorance, but by choice. In the following years, various versions attempted to explain what happened. Some downplayed the death toll, others did not deny the facts, but framed them as an emotional reaction to the evidence. The reality was that during the liberation of Dhaka, dozens of German soldiers were killed without trial or interrogation. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army reached the gates of Auschwitz. It was January 1945. Soviet troops found some 7,000 prisoners still alive there. The rest had been moved weeks earlier in a forced retreat. What they left behind was not just sick or debilitated people, but also an entire infrastructure, barracks, crematoriums, and warehouses. The records mention finding piles of human hair, eyeglasses, shoes, and personal belongings organized by type. They also found open graves, burned remains, and traces of recent executions. The troops made no immediate public statements, but internal reports described scenes similar to those found by the Americans at Dhaka. Colonel Basil P. Treno wrote that the prisoners were little more than breathing skeletons. They were not soldiers or people wounded in combat but civilians, many of them elderly, women or children who had survived under extreme conditions. After the liberation, facilities such as Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen were used by the Soviet authorities to imprison German officers, collaborators, and civilians considered dangerous. It was reported that the detainees' situation there was not very different from that previously suffered by Jewish prisoners. It was not the same type of repression, but the conditions were equally harsh. Cold cells, scarce food, constant surveillance. Scarce food, constant surveillance. Some reports from the time described these detention centers as places of re-education, but also as prisons for those seen as a threat to the new order that was being established. Among those arrested were soldiers, former Nazi Party officials, sympathizers, and also Polish citizens who had been Germanized during the occupation. The line between guilty and suspected prisoners was not always clear, and decisions were made quickly. In the case of Dau, the number of those freed was officially announced by the U.S. High Command. More than 32,000 people. It was also reported that nearly 300 enemy prisoners had been killed during the operation. At the time, the manner of their deaths was not made public. No mention was made of the executions by soldiers. This information was kept confidential for many years. Only with time did more details become known through letters, testimonies, and declassified documents. Images taken during the entry into the camp became part of the official archives. Some were used as evidence in subsequent trials. Others remained in storage for decades. The objective was not immediate, but the record had already been made. The gates of the camp had been opened, and with them a new process began. Document, understand, judge. Justice enters the scene. Nuremberg trials and nameless remains. After the liberation of the camps, the next stage was not immediate. Time was needed to organize, understand, and classify the emerging information. The images captured by the soldiers, the testimonies collected on the spot, the belongings found in basement and warehouses, the documents abandoned by fleeing officers, everything had to be analyzed. What until then had been suspicions or fragmentary reports was now transformed into direct evidence. The Allied authorities decided that it was not enough to release the prisoners, nor was it enough to show what had happened. They had to judge. A process began that would later be known as the Nuremberg trials. There, the names who for years had been signatories of orders, heads of departments, and visible figures of the regime were called to answer before an international tribunal. One of the defendants was Fritz Say, head of the forced labor program in the occupied territories. During his interrogation, he defended himself by saying that he had acted under orders that his task was to organize labor, not concentration camps. The documents presented indicated otherwise. They detailed figures, movements of people, and internal correspondence that linked him to mass transfers of civilians to German factories. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, was also prosecuted. He was held responsible for signing reprisal orders and authorizing operations that included the execution of hostages and deportations. During the trial, he argued that his role was military with no direct involvement in decisions regarding the camps. Records showed that he had been present at meetings where deportation routes and collective punishment measures were defined. Another of those convicted was Arthur Seyssen-Kort. He had been Reich Commissioner in the Netherlands. During his tenure, mass deportations of Dutch Jews were implemented, as well as public executions of members of the resistance. The documents presented showed decrees signed by him, orders for the confiscation of property, and records of collective arrests. His defense was based on the fact that he had attempted to maintain order in a complex situation, but the court found his active participation in the implementation of extermination policies to be clear. Also on trial was Julius Streicher, editor of the weekly Dirma, known for its anti-Semitic propaganda. Although he did not directly participate in military operations or camp administration, his constant incitement of hatred and his role as a promoter of anti-Semitism were considered central elements in creating a climate that allowed the crimes committed. During the court sessions, films taken by the Allies themselves during the liberation of the camps were shown. Images of piled-up bodies, infested barracks, and still-warm ovens were shown. Letters were also read. Survivor testimonies were presented, and recordings of interrogations were played. The defendants' responses ranged from denial to evasion and attempts to minimize their responsibility. Some said they had no knowledge of what was happening in the camps. Others claimed they were following orders. Still, others remained silent. Few acknowledged any degree of guilt. The documentation was so abundant that in many cases witnesses weren't needed. It was enough to read the signed orders, review the inventories, the transport lists, the forms with names and dates. These weren't oral accounts, but complete files with the signatures of those responsible. The convictions were swift. Many of the accused were sentenced to death. The executions were carried out by hanging. No ceremony or final speech was offered. The execution of the sentence was recorded, and the bodies were cremated. The ashes were scattered in the S River. No names, plaques, or landmarks were placed there. The intention was that no trace would remain, that no group could claim, commemorate, or turn these remains into symbols. It was an administrative decision, not a symbolic one. It was implemented quickly and without exception. The tribunal records preserved the documents, photographs, and minutes of each session. Copies were distributed among the Allied countries. Some were archived, others were used as educational material. But the content was clear. Those responsible had been judged based on direct evidence without the need for speeches or reflections. While this was happening in Nuremberg, camps, graves, and warehouses continued to be discovered in other parts of Europe. Each had its own dynamic, its specific history. But the pattern was similar. Prisoners reduced to the bare minimum. Facilities designed for mass confinement. Meticulous records of entries and exits. In some cases, the liberating troops found no one alive, only objects, traces, or vestiges of an escape. In others, survivors were found who could not speak, walk, or react immediately. The deterioration was extreme. Doctors documented the case, trying to recover basic functions. But the damage had already been done. It wasn't just hunger, but months or years of confinement, exposure to the cold, forced labor, and medical neglect. The numbers added up. The camps were named. Those responsible were located. Some managed to escape before being captured. They changed their names, hid in rural areas, immigrated under false identities. Some lived for decades unidentified. Others were discovered years later when new documents came to light or when testimony placed them in specific locations. In several countries, belated investigations were opened. Traces were sought, witnesses were contacted, extradition requests were made, but many died before facing trial. Most legal actions were concentrated in the first years after the war. Afterward, interest waned. Even so, the archives continued to grow. Letters, memoirs, personal diaries, hidden photographs, everything was added to the general record. Liberation did not end with the closure of the camps. It continued in the courts, in searches, in reports that still appear in libraries and archives today. At the same time, some local authorities, both in Western Europe and in the territories liberated by the Soviet Union, established commissions to collect testimonies from survivors. The goal was to record what happened while memory was still fresh before time altered the details. These testimonies were diverse. Some were brief, others detailed. They described routines, punishments, names of commanders, specific moments. The aim was not to find culprits, but to construct a narrative based on the facts. The documents were compiled, archived, and in many cases forgotten for years. Only with the passage of time did they begin to be digitized, translated, and made available to the public. The account spoke of endless lines, frozen latrines, insufficient rations, punishments for looking at the wrong guard. Details that, when added together, formed a clear picture. For those who had lived inside those places, liberation did not mean the end of everything. Many had nowhere to go. Their homes had been destroyed. Their families were missing. Their communities no longer existed. Some remained in displacement camps. Others attempted to immigrate. Several returned to their hometowns, only to find no one waiting for them. Life went on, but not as before. There were documents to manage, identities to reconstruct, bodies to heal. Lists of survivors were compiled. Names were searched for among the ruins. Some spent weeks in front of military offices asking for a mother, a son, or a brother, and the answers didn't always come. The names appeared on papers, but the people didn't. Other times, someone was found, but the emotional distance was such that reunion became difficult. Returning wasn't automatic. The trauma was still present. What remained after opening the door? As time passed, details began to emerge that had been kept secret during the war. Some soldiers who participated in the liberation wrote memoirs. Others gave interviews many years later. Several of them said that the images of the first day were never erased from their minds. They described the smell, the strange silence, the gaze of those still alive. These were not scenes of battle, but something more difficult to assimilate. There were people sitting on the ground unresponsive, others hiding for fear of further punishment, and also those who, upon seeing the Allied soldiers, simply collapsed. Their bodies couldn't take any more. The liberation wasn't a celebration. It was an interruption in a routine of misery. Some prisoners didn't immediately understand what was happening. They didn't know whether to trust, if it was a trap, whether they should obey or run. Whether they should obey or run. The soldiers, for their part, were also unprepared for that scene. They had been trained to fight, not to care for people in a state of starvation or terminal illness. In some cases, mistakes were unavoidable. Giving food to those who'd gone weeks without regular meals led to medical complications. Several died from indigestion. Others couldn't withstand the change in climate, the transition from an uncovered bunk to a makeshift ambulance. Doctors tried to stabilize the weakest, but the number of those in need exceeded any expectations. Improvised hospitals were set up, mobile kitchens were set up, and cleaning crews were sent. But all this took time, and in many cases, it was too late. Prisoners died even after being liberated. Their bodies no longer responded, nor did their minds. As the camps were documented, lists, folders, and records appeared. The Nazischad recorded everything precisely. There were sheets with names, dates, transport routes, quantities of food assigned, and punishments meted out. Some documents were found intact. Others were damaged by weather, fire, or hasty escape. Even so, much of what had happened was reconstructed. In several camps, piles of personal belongings were found: watches, photographs, children's books, identity documents. Nothing was left to chance. Every object had been classified. Many prisoners upon arrival were forced to hand over all their belongings. The objects were stored or sold. Others were simply accumulated. At Avitz, piles of human hair were found, separated by color. There were also collections of teeth, prosthetics, and shoes, not as a result of neglect, but as part of a structured system. The classification of objects was part of the subsequent process. An attempt was made to return what could be returned, but in most cases, there was no one to give anything to. Families were dead or dispersed. Archives were created to preserve what was found. Some objects were displayed in museums, others were stored in numbered boxes. The goal was to preserve the items as evidence. It wasn't about memory, but about material proof. Every item of clothing, every label, every mark was part of a case. No interpretations or embellishments were allowed. It was only recorded. The approach was technical, but the accumulation generated a clear picture. The logic of the camp was not one of spontaneous punishment, but rather one of sustained procedure. Every action was documented, every name noted, every transport registered. The Allies also found photographs taken by the Nazis themselves, images of construction lists and inspections. Some showed officers posing, others prisoners performing forced labor. There were also plans, diagrams, and instructions. All of this was integrated into the official archives. Texts were translated, materials compiled and presented in court. Some images were so explicit that they were withheld. Others were used as training material. The documents became part of an international network of archives. The goal was not only immediate justice, but also to prevent the facts from being denied later. The volume of material was such that denial was untenable. Each liberated camp provided more information. Each rescued prisoner had astery. Each recovered object had a history. After the trials, the camps were mostly dismantled. Some became memorials. Others were closed to the public. Several remained abandoned for years until it was decided to recover their facilities for historical purposes. The intention was to preserve the site as it had been found, unbuted, unmodified. Some barracks were repaired only to prevent their collapse. Plaques were placed, routes were laid out, and rules for visits were established. Political symbols and unauthorized photographs were not allowed. The museums were not centers of interpretation, but of preservation. Tours were guided with precise explanations. No conclusions were offered, only facts. Testimonies were presented without alteration. Photographs were unretouched. The intention was not to shape perception, but to present the truth directly, without interpretation. At the same time, efforts began to locate mass graves. Burials were discovered in multiple countries, some near the camps, others in remote rural areas where executions had taken place. Exhumations were carried out, samples collected. In some instances, victims could be identified. In others, they remained unknown. The remains were moved to designated cemeteries, with stones marked only by numbers. No names, only dates and codes. The task was not symbolic. It was archival. Authorities aimed to count, not commemorate. Mourning was personal. Record-keeping was institutional. The numbers grew. The lists expanded. So did the questions. Answers, however, were found in the documents, not in later interpretations. For many soldiers, witnessing the liberation of a camp marked the end of their war experience. Not because their duties ended, but because afterward, everything else seemed insignificant. Some never spoke of it again. Others made it their defining story. Many took photographs, unaware that decades later, those images would serve as crucial evidence. Letters were sent home describing what had been seen. Some were preserved in personal collections, others in public archives. All agreed on one fact: the impact was indelible. It could not be erased. It could not be undone. One learned only to live alongside it. Documentation continued to grow. Books were published, exhibitions organized, research centers established. Yet the fundamental content remained unchanged. What did those first liberated witnesses see? These were not theories. These were not interpretations. They were records, written documents, photographs, filmed evidence. The information was direct, unembellished, factual. Time did not alter this truth. It only expanded access. The more archives opened, the more data became available, yet the essence remained. The horror did not need explanation. It only needed to be shown as it was. That is how this chapter concluded. With open fields, comprehensive archives, and images that could no longer be erased. There was no emotional closure, no complete restitution. Only records remained. Because in the end, what endured were what could be preserved. A halted train, a list of names, a signed document, a lifeless body in a carriage, an unanswered letter. That was what was discovered when the doors were opened, and that was all that remained.